The scream of my mother's voice still rings in my memory, slicing through the quiet of a childhood I used to pretend was normal. "Do not look at him, Evelyn. Do you understand me? He is dangerous." Her words slammed into me all through my early years, sharp, final, cold, and for a long time I believed them. But nothing prepared me for the truth waiting at the end of that road. Not the 10-foot fence my parents built to keep him out, not the 3 lawsuits they filed just to drive him away, not the nights I lay awake hearing them whisper about him like he was a monster hiding under my bed, and certainly not the day he died when I found myself standing alone at his funeral, staring into a grave no one else cared to visit. The priest didn't know his name. The neighbors didn't show up. My parents didn't bother to ask where I'd gone. But then a young lawyer stepped out from the shadows, handed me an envelope with trembling hands, and said, "Miss Ward, he wanted only you to have this." The weight of that envelope felt heavier than the coffin. Inside it was a truth so devastating, so impossible, so intimate, it split my life into before and after. I once thought my parents hated our neighbor because they feared him. I was wrong. They hated him because they feared the day I would learn who he really was. The funeral was on a bleak February afternoon, the kind where clouds hang low like unspoken confessions. I arrived early, standing beside a modest plot of earth, barely framed by winter grass. No flowers, no visitors, not even the thin courtesy of curiosity from strangers. The cemetery was silent except for the scrape of shovels preparing the site. The only sound that wasn't mechanical was my breath, shallow, uneven, echoing a kind of grief I didn't yet know how to understand. The coffin looked too small for a man who had somehow filled the edges of my life even when he was forbidden to stand in its center. I pulled my coat tighter, wishing the wind were the only thing that made me shiver. Raymond Kessler had been my neighbor for 34 years. And yet I was the only one here. As the priest recited verses in a voice so automatic it might as well have been wind, my thoughts drifted to the fence, the monstrous wooden wall that ran between our properties like a scar. 10 feet tall, reinforced, stained a dark color that seemed determined to swallow sunlight. I'd once believed my father built it to protect us. I now knew better. Still, even this morning, even now, as the coffin lowered inch by inch, I could hear my mother's clipped warning. "He is dangerous, Evelyn. Men like him destroy families." If she had stood beside me today, would she have felt triumph, relief, disgust? Or would she have stared into the grave and felt what I felt, an ache shaped like regret? I doubted she would ever come here. My father certainly wouldn't. They had spent too many years waging a quiet, bitter war against this man, suing him, shaming him, pointing at him with trembling conviction every time I dared ask why. The truth was, they didn't hate him. They feared him. They feared what he knew, what he'd lived through, what he kept hidden. The priest closed his book. The workers stepped away. It was done. And I remained frozen. Part of me wanted to apologize to the earth, to the sky, to him, for believing my parents, for keeping my distance, for not understanding who he really was until it was too late to thank him. I stood there until the cemetery crew left, until the priest climbed into his car, until the last traces of ceremony faded into the cold. Only when the wind shifted and dusk crept across the sky did I turn to leave. That was when I saw him. A young man in an ill-fitting suit, mid-30s, brown hair, slicked-back shoes, muddy from the grass. He approached with a nervous, hesitant energy, as though unsure how close he was allowed to stand. "Miss Ward?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. He held a leather briefcase so old it looked inherited. "My name is Andrew Callahan. I was Mr. Kessler's attorney." Attorney? The word hit strangely. Raymond had spent a lifetime alone, so why would he need an attorney? Why would he leave instructions? Why would he care if no one came to this funeral? Andrew reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sealed envelope. "He left this for you. Explicitly for you. He insisted." My pulse quickened. For me, he nodded. He said, You would understand when the time came. The envelope was cold in my hands, as though it had been waiting in the dark for far too long. My name Evelyn was written in slanted handwriting I recognized instantly, even though it had been years since I'd seen it. "I don't understand," I whispered. Andrew hesitated. "He spoke of you often. With affection." Affection. The word caught in my throat. "He wasn't the man your parents made him out to be," Andrew added gently. "That's all I will say. The rest is in the letter." He stepped back as if his part in this story was over. Maybe it was. I stood alone again, the envelope heavy in my palm. I held it tightly, as though it might slip away like all the moments I had wasted. Before opening it, I let my gaze settle once more on the mound of earth. A quiet promise rose in my chest, one shaped by longing and guilt, one I felt deep in my bones. "I'm here," I whispered to the grave. "And I'll learn the truth. I swear I will." I walked slowly back to my car, the envelope clutched against my chest. My hands shook, but I didn't let go. I couldn't. Every step made me feel as if the world were changing shape beneath me, as if the ground were shifting to reveal something long buried. When I slid into the driver's seat and shut the door, the silence felt too intimate, too expectant. I rested the envelope on my lap, tracing the edges with trembling fingers. I inhaled, exhaled, and opened it. The smell of old paper hit me first, the kind of scent that carried time inside it. The letter unfolded neatly, as though handled with care, perhaps many times by hands that knew they wouldn't hold it forever. "My dearest Evelyn," it began. My breath caught before I could read further. The words blurred for a moment. I blinked, wiped my eyes, and continued. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone. And it means I must finally tell you what I never had the courage to say in life." My heart pounded. "I have loved you every day of your life." Tears burned hot and fast down my cheeks as the world fell silent around me. "Every day of your life." The letter continued. "You were kept from me, hidden from me. But I watched you grow, spoke to you when I could cherished every moment you allowed me to be near you. You brightened years of my life I thought would remain dark." A sob escaped me. I covered my mouth. "I know your parents told you to fear me. They did so not because I had harmed them, but because I knew a truth they spent their lives trying to bury." A chill ran through me. "Evelyn, I am your grandfather." I read the line again, and again. My grandfather. The man behind the fence. The man who carved birds with trembling hands. The man who watched me grow up in stolen fragments through a sliver of wood. The man my parents declared dangerous. He was family. Blood. Love. My chest ached with something sharp, a mix of guilt, understanding, devastation, and something else I hadn't felt in years. Belonging. The rest of the letter waited patiently, but I couldn't read it yet. I needed time, breath, space. My world had cracked open in a single sentence, and the pieces hovered mid-air, waiting to fall into something recognizable. Outside the cemetery, lights flickered on pale beacons against the thickening dusk. For a long moment I simply stared at Raymond's house across the street from mine. The windows were dark, the curtains still. But the shadows inside no longer frightened me. They called to me. They whispered, "Come, Evelyn. The truth is waiting." With trembling hands, I refolded the letter and slid it back into the envelope. Tomorrow I would go inside that house. Tomorrow I would walk through the rooms he had lived in for decades. Tomorrow I would find the attic where the rest of the truth waited, aching, patient, ready. Tonight I held the envelope to my heart and let myself feel everything I'd been denied for 34 years. Love, grief, recognition, and a promise of clarity. Because the story of my life had been rewritten in a single breath. And I wasn't afraid of the truth anymore. I stood at the kitchen sink that Sunday morning, staring through the window at the 10-foot fence my parents once built with a kind of religious fury, and for the first time in years I let myself remember what it felt like the day they declared our neighbor Raymond Kessler a threat to everything they claimed to love. I was only 7 then, too young to understand the way fear and secrets rot inside a home, but old enough to feel the coldness that lingered whenever his name slipped into the air. My parents never used his name as something human, only as a warning. He is dangerous. He is unstable. He is not to be trusted. They said those words so often that I almost believed them, almost convinced myself the man who lived 20 feet away could somehow reach through the walls and ruin us. But the truth was, ruins were already forming inside our house long before I understood what shape they would take. Most families talked during breakfast. Mine moved around the kitchen like ghosts avoiding one another. My mother fussed with the stove opening and closing cabinets just to have something to do with her hands. My father hid behind his newspaper flipping pages loudly whenever silence pressed too close. I sat at the table with a bowl of cereal that had long gone soggy. The routine never changed. Their tension was a kind of weather inside the house, predictable, heavy. I used to wonder if other children felt that weight before they even learned to name it. My father broke the quiet first. He lowered the newspaper just enough so he could stare past me through the window directly at the fence. He didn't even hide his disdain. "That man hasn't left his driveway in 3 days," he said, shaking his head, standing out there looking around like he's waiting for something. My mother didn't look up from the pan she was scrubbing. "He wants attention." "Don't give him any." "He's trouble," my father muttered as if speaking to the floor. My mother repeated it softly under her breath as though it were a prayer. "He's dangerous." I stopped eating. Dangerous. I didn't know what that meant in the real world. In my imagination, danger meant monsters or strangers or shadows that chased you down alleys. But Raymond didn't look like a monster. I had seen glimpses of him through cracks in the fence before my father sealed every inch. He had white hair, slow movements, the soft hunch of someone who carried more sadness than strength. He reminded me of the old men I saw at church who shuffled in with trembling hands and too much humility. And yet every time my father spoke his name, something inside him hardened. My mother caught me looking toward the fence. "Evelyn," she snapped. "Eyes on your food." I jerked back to my bowl. But inside a question pulsed quietly. What did he do? What was so terrible that it made 2 adults live in fear of a man who looked like he barely had enough breath left to walk to his mailbox? After breakfast, I went outside with the intention of reading on the porch, but I didn't even make it to the steps. There he was again in his yard, though mostly hidden by the fence my father had built. I only caught the top curve of his shoulders and the movement of his hand as he set a flower pot on the ground. He wasn't doing anything threatening. If anything, he looked lonely. I stood there uncertain until the screen door slammed behind me. My father stepped out, his gaze slicing directly past me. He watched Raymond like a predator watches something it refuses to let near its territory. Without a word, he grabbed the broom and marched toward the fence, sweeping dust at its base, even though there was nothing there to sweep. I turned to go inside, but he spoke. "Don't ever stand near this fence. Do you hear me, Evelyn? Do you hear me?" "Yes." He stared at me, his eyes hard and unblinking. "That man is not someone you look at, talk to, or think about. Is that clear?" I remember nodding. I remember swallowing hard. I remember feeling the unspoken threat tucked behind every syllable. But mostly I remember the contradiction blooming quietly in my small chest. Because a week earlier, I had heard Raymond humming. Soft, gentle, almost like a lullaby carried by the wind. Dangerous people didn't hum lullabies. Dangerous people didn't kneel to tend flowers. Dangerous people didn't look tired and sad and alone. Inside the house, the air felt even heavier. My mother cleaned obsessively when she was nervous, and she was working herself into a frenzy. She scrubbed countertops that were already spotless, rearranged spice jars, refolded towels. Every clatter of glass or metal felt like a symptom of something she refused to name out loud. "Mom," I asked quietly, "why do you think he's dangerous?" She froze. Her back stiffened, her breath hitched, and her shoulders lifted in a way that told me I had stepped onto forbidden ground. "Because your father says so," she answered without turning around. "But why does he say so?" She spun around so fast, I flinched. "Evelyn, do not question your father. He knows things you do not. He understands things you cannot. That man is dangerous, and that is the only answer you need." Her voice cracked on the last word. And that scared me more than anything. It was the first hint that her fear wasn't truly about Raymond. It was about my father, about what would happen if she ever dared disagree. I spent the rest of the day moving around the house quietly, trying not to draw attention to myself. The tension only worsened as afternoon shadows stretched across the yard. My father paced the living room like someone expecting an attack. My mother wiped her palms on her apron repeatedly. I climbed to my room and pressed my ear to the window. The hum started again. Soft, barely audible. A tune I couldn't place but warm enough to make my heart ache. Without thinking, I followed the sound outside, walking as quietly as I could until I reached the edge of the fence. I wasn't planning to talk to him. I wasn't even planning to look through the hole. I just wanted to hear the humming. But when I knelt down, something caught my eye. A shape. A sliver of light, a glimmer of movement, and then a shadow slowly shifting toward the small knot of wood that time had carved into an opening. Before I knew it, before fear or obedience or caution could pull me back, my face was near the hole. Then I saw him. Not the version my parents described, not the monster my father imagined. Just an old man sitting in a chair with a book on his lap and the gentlest expression I had ever seen. He wasn't humming now. He was simply breathing, eyes closed, a look of peace as rare in my world as kindness itself. He opened his eyes at the sound of my breath. He didn't startle. He didn't glare. He didn't look offended or suspicious. He smiled. Softly. As if he had been waiting for this exact moment. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly. Something in me tightened. "I know. And yet you are." I heard humming. He nodded slowly. "I hum sometimes when I'm lonely." I swallowed. "Are you lonely a lot?" He let out a breath that trembled just slightly. "Every day." His honesty tugged at something deep inside me. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to comfort a grown man when I could barely comfort myself. Before I could think of anything, he added, "But I feel less lonely right now." I felt heat rush to my cheeks. We looked at each other through that tiny hole, and for a moment the fence didn't feel like a barrier. It felt like a connection. Then he reached into his pocket and rolled a small wooden carving toward me. A bird. Smooth, carefully shaped, the kind of thing made by hands that worked slowly and with love. "For you," he whispered. I stared at it. Why? Because someone should give you something kind today. My breath caught. Behind me, the porch door creaked. My father's voice called my name, sharp and irritated. I panicked. Raymond saw the fear in my eyes and leaned back, gently lifting his hand in a small, reassuring gesture. "Go." I won't say a word. I ran inside before my father could come searching. Dinner that night tasted like nothing. My mother kept glancing toward the window as if expecting danger to crawl through the glass. My father muttered darkly under his breath, the words too low to decipher but heavy enough to alter the air. I didn't speak. I barely breathed. The wooden bird sat hidden in my pocket, warm from my hand, warm from his. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a truth began to take shape. If this gentle old man was dangerous, then the danger inside my home was much, much greater. And that realization, though still fragile, was the first crack in the story my parents had built around me. A crack that would grow wider with every passing year until the day it finally split my world open. The summer I turned 7 stretched out like a long, quiet ache, the kind that settles into a child before she even learns to name loneliness. Most afternoons my parents argued behind closed doors, believing thin walls and lowered voices were enough to hide their discontent. I would slip outside with a tennis ball, pretending the yard was a world of my own, though even that space felt borrowed. I remember the heat of that August day, the way the grass stuck to my knees, the way my ball thumped rhythmically against the fence my father had built with his own hands. It felt like hitting against a prison wall, each bounce a reminder that something on the other side was forbidden. And then the ball bounced wrong. It sailed upward, clipped the top of the fence, and vanished. I froze, not because I'd lost the ball, but because that ball was one of the few things in my life that felt like mine. My grandfather, at least the man I thought was my grandfather, had given it to me before he died. My parents kept little of his memory around just a framed photo in the hallway and a box of ties my father refused to throw away. But that ball, for a lonely child, sentimental things become sacred. I stepped closer to the fence, torn between fear of what lay beyond and fear of disappointing my father. I crouched, pushing my fingers into the dirt until I felt where it dipped slightly below the lowest plank. That's when I noticed a small, imperfect opening near the ground. A knot in the wood must have fallen away long ago, leaving a space just big enough to peer through. My heart hammered as I knelt in the grass. Somewhere behind me, a screen door slammed. Somewhere inside, my parents' voices thudded against the windows. But here at the base of the fence, the world felt strangely still. I lowered my eye to the hole. At first, I saw nothing but a blur of sunlight. Then I saw a patch of green Raymond's lawn, always neater than ours. And then I saw him. He sat in a worn wooden chair, a book open in his lap. His white hair glowed faintly under the sun. His face, lined with the softness of age, turned slightly, as though he sensed movement. I didn't expect him to notice me. But he did. He looked directly into the hole directly at me. For a terrifying heartbeat, I thought he would shout, that he would stand up, march to the fence, and prove everything my parents had said about him. But instead, he did something that shook the foundations of everything I believed about him. He smiled. A small, tentative, gentle smile. "You lost something," he said, his voice warm and unexpectedly steady. I swallowed. My ball. He nodded as though the answer made sense to him in a deeper way than I understood. He stood slowly, joints cracking softly, and shuffled toward where the ball lay near his flower bed. He picked it up and rolled it through the hole to me. "There you go, sweetheart." My breath caught. My parents never used words like that. Not with me. "Thank you," I whispered. "You're welcome." He looked at me again, really looked, his eyes softer than anything I had ever seen at home. I felt exposed and safe at the same time. "I should let you go," he murmured. "They'll worry if they see you here." He didn't need to say who they were, but something in me wouldn't move. Children don't always understand kindness, but we feel the rare warmth of it instinctively, like a creature recognizing safe shelter. My parents say I shouldn't talk to you," I blurted. His expression flickered with something like grief. "I know they do," he said quietly. "And you should listen to your parents. They only want what's best." "Then why are you talking to me?" I asked. He smiled again, but this time it trembled as if he were holding back something heavy. Because every child deserves kindness, even in small doses. I held the ball tighter. He reached into his sweater pocket and pushed a small wrapped candy through the hole. "Here, don't tell them." The candy glimmered gold under the sunlight. My mother never let me eat sweets. My father said sugar rotted teeth and weakened discipline. But here was a stranger, a man I was told to fear, offering me the smallest act of care I had felt in years. I took it. My hands shook. Behind me, the back door creaked open. I gasped and stood up so fast I scraped my knee. Raymond pulled his hand back, instantly retreating into his yard. That night at dinner, my mother asked why there was dirt on my knees. My father watched me too closely. I lied for the first time in my life. It felt like swallowing stones. But lying became easier the next day, because the next day I returned to the fence, and Raymond was already there. He was sitting in his chair with the same book, the same quiet patience, as if he had known I'd come back, as if he'd been waiting for me. I knelt down before the hole, my hands damp with anticipation, and he leaned slightly toward me. "Hello again," he said. I whispered back, "Hi." I didn't tell him I had replayed our conversation all night. I didn't tell him I'd hidden the candy in a box under my bed like a treasure. Children guard small joys the way grown people guard secrets. "What are you reading?" I asked. He lifted the cover. "A book about birds." "Why?" he chuckled softly. "Because they're simple and honest. They do what they must without hiding who they are." I didn't know then why that answer made my throat tighten. Day by day, our conversations grew longer. He asked me about school, about the stories I liked, about why I often looked sad when I talked about home. I asked him about the flowers in his yard, about the books he kept near his chair, about why he always seemed to pause before answering certain questions. Once he said, "I listen more than I speak." "You don't speak like my parents," I said before I could stop myself. He smiled a little. "Is that good or bad? I think it's good." His eyes softened with something like relief. One day he passed a tiny wooden bird through the hole. It fit perfectly into my palm, the wings smoothed by careful carving. I stared at it in awe. "Did you make this? I carved it years ago," he said, looking away. "I thought, maybe you'd like it." I whispered, "I love it." The moment those words left my mouth, something inside him shifted. His smile became sadder, deeper, more fragile. I didn't understand then, but much later I would realize that he had carved that bird long before he ever met me, long before I was even born. That was the first time I sensed his loneliness. The second time came a week later when I asked if he had children. He hesitated for so long that I thought he wouldn't answer at all. Then he said quietly, "I did." "What happened to them?" He looked down at his hands, hands that had carved tiny gifts for me, hands that trembled more often now. Some things he said softly are too painful to speak aloud. I wanted to ask more. I didn't. Something told me not to pry. But questions sprouted in me like wild weeds. If he had children, where were they? If he had a family, why was he always alone? If he had done something terrible, why did he never look angry or cruel? Yet every time I brought these questions home, every time I even said his name, a storm brewed between my parents. One evening, I overheard my father say, "If she ever talks to him again." My mother interrupted sharply, "What would you do?" My father didn't answer. His silence shook me more than shouting ever had. From that night on, my visits to the fence became a secret ritual, something I protected fiercely. I learned when my parents napped, when they argued, when they made phone calls in separate rooms. Those were the windows when I darted outside, knelt before the hole, and waited for the gentle voice on the other side. And Raymond always appeared. Always. He told me stories about airplanes he'd flown in his youth, about places he'd traveled, about the way mountains look at sunrise, and how ocean wind feels on your face in the dead of winter. His voice made distant places feel close, possible real. Once I asked, "Why did you travel so much?" His answer was slow, thoughtful. Because I wanted to understand the world, and because home didn't feel like home anymore. I didn't understand, but I felt the truth in his words, like a soft bruise. One late afternoon, when the sky turned pink behind the rooftops, I heard my name spoken gently from the other side of the fence. "Evelyn," he said. "Yes, you're a bright child. You see things most people ignore." I didn't know what to say. He continued, voice softer now. "One day you'll understand why your parents fear me. But that fear isn't about what I've done. It's about what they can't bear for you to know." A chill crept through me. No, what he didn't answer. Instead, he whispered, "Just remember this. Adults lie far more than children do, usually to themselves." That night I lay awake long after the house fell silent. His words echoed in my chest, twisting into shapes I couldn't name. Adults lie, my parents lie. Raymond didn't. And somewhere between fear and hope, between curiosity and dread, I realized something that would shape the rest of my life. The most dangerous thing in my world wasn't the man behind the fence. It was the truth my parents were desperate to keep locked away. By the time I turned 10, the rhythm of my afternoons had settled into two distinct worlds: the cold, echoing rooms of my own house, and the warm little pocket of sunlight waiting beneath the fence. I would race through homework with a kind of desperate efficiency, listening for the moment when my parents' voices rose in their usual arguments or drifted into the muffled distance of phone calls. Those were my windows, my permission slips. As soon as I sensed their attention pulled elsewhere, I slipped into the backyard and knelt in the grass, feeling the familiar thrum of excitement rise in my chest. It was the only time of day I felt like myself. Sometimes Raymond was already there, as if he knew exactly when I'd appear. Other times I'd wait only a few seconds before hearing the soft scrape of his chair or the faint shuffle of his steps moving across his yard. He always spoke in that same gentle tone, as though every word were shaped carefully, lovingly meant for me alone. "What did you learn today, Evelyn?" he would ask. And I would tell him everything. Things I never spoke about at home. Things no one in my family ever asked. He listened the way a thirsty man drinks water, with an intensity that made me feel important, visible, wanted. Sometimes he laughed at my jokes. Sometimes he asked questions that made me think harder than any teacher ever had. Sometimes he sat in quiet admiration while I explained my favorite history stories. "You have a curious mind," he'd say. "That's a gift. Don't let anyone take that from you." No one had ever said anything like that to me before. Certainly not my parents, who reserved praise the way some people reserve fine china locked away, never used, only displayed to impress others. Around them, I learned to shrink myself. Around Raymond, I learned to stretch, to breathe, to wonder. He shared pieces of himself too, in small, careful fragments. He told me about the countries he had visited when he was younger, about the way the air smelled in Rome at dawn, about the colors of the market in Marrakesh, about the quiet ache he felt when he stood at the edge of the Grand Canyon and realized how small one life really was. His voice always softened when he talked about traveling, as if he were speaking not just of places but of versions of himself long gone. "Do you still travel?" I once asked. He smiled in that sad way I was beginning to recognize. "Not anymore. My world is smaller now, but yours doesn't have to be." I didn't understand the depth of his sadness then. I just knew I wanted to keep talking to him, to keep building that secret world between us. And every few days he gave me something: a polished stone he'd found years ago on the Oregon coast, a comic book with pages soft from age, a bookmark carved with delicate swirling patterns. Each treasure felt like a lifeline, and I hid them all in a shoebox under my bed, terrified of what my parents would do if they discovered them. My mother especially had become increasingly suspicious. She watched me with an intensity that felt like a spotlight. Her eyes flicked to my hands, my pockets, my shoes, as if expecting to find evidence of betrayal. One afternoon I made a mistake. A tiny one, but in our house, tiny mistakes had a way of exploding into catastrophes. I dropped a candy wrapper in the backyard. It wasn't even from Raymond, just something I'd been saving. But when my mother came outside later that evening and spotted it near the fence, she reacted as though she'd found a live grenade. "Where did this come from?" she demanded. My heart thudded painfully. I don't know." Her voice sharpened. "Evelyn, do not lie to me. I'm not." She crouched down, snatching the wrapper with trembling fingers. Her face drained of color. "Did he give this to you, Mom? No, answer me," she screamed so loudly I jumped. Before I could speak, my father appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound. His eyes swept the scene and landed on the wrapper. "What is that?" he barked. My mother held it out to him, her voice unsteady. "Candy," his jaw clenched. "From him, I don't know," she whispered. He turned to me. "You've been told never to talk to that man." "Have you disobeyed us?" I shook my head too quickly, too desperately. I could feel the lie bleeding through my skin, trembling in my breath. My father stepped forward, towering above me. "If I ever find out you've been near that fence again, there will be consequences you won't forget." My mother looked away. She didn't comfort me. She didn't defend me. She didn't ask why a child might need kindness so badly that she'd risk punishment for it. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my shoebox of treasures tucked under my ribs like a secret heartbeat. I knew I was living two separate lives now. I knew that one of them, my quiet, luminous world at the fence, would be destroyed if my parents ever found out. The next afternoon I went back anyway. Raymond saw the tension in my eyes before I even said a word. "Something happened," he said gently. I nodded. "My mom found a wrapper. She thinks you gave it to me." He exhaled slowly. "I'm sorry. I should be more careful." "No, I should be more careful." He shook his head. "Children shouldn't have to be careful just to feel cared for." I blinked hard. "They think you're dangerous." A flicker of pain crossed his face. "I know. Why do they hate you?" He took a long time to answer. His gaze drifted toward the house I lived in, a house painted with the colors of silence and fear. "It's not hate," he finally said. "It's fear. And fear grows when people bury the truth instead of facing it. But what truth?" He looked down, his voice barely audible. "A truth you're not old enough to hold yet." It wasn't the first time he hinted at something deeper, and it wouldn't be the last. But that day, the heaviness in his voice sank into me like a quiet bruise. I sensed a story swirling just beneath the surface of his words, something fractured and fragile and bound tightly to my family. Still, the next moment he surprised me. "Close your eyes," he said. I hesitated, then obeyed. I heard the soft scrape of wood against his chair, the faint rustle of paper. Then something light touched my palm. I opened my eyes and saw a small wooden bird similar to the other he'd given me, but more detailed, more careful. Under its wing, carved in tiny script, was a single letter. E. I stared at him. "You carved this for me." "I did," he said softly. When he hesitated again, his eyes filling with something I didn't understand. "A long time ago." I turned the bird over in my palm, feeling its smooth curves, its careful lines. A warmth spread through me, one that felt suspiciously like belonging. But the questions only grew. Why did he carve something for me long before he ever met me? Why did he look at me sometimes with an ache that was almost paternal? Why did my parents glare at him with such venom? I tucked the bird into my pocket, feeling its small weight like a promise. As the sun dipped lower, Raymond began telling me about the first time he learned to carve wood. He spoke of his father teaching him when he was young, of long evenings spent sanding, shaping, finding beauty in imperfection. His voice grew soft as he drifted into memory. "I used to dream," he said, "of teaching a child of my own someday. Someone who might want to learn, someone who might sit with me while I carved." "Did you ever teach your kid?" I asked. He looked at me for a long moment, his smile sad and distant. "No. Life had other plans." His words hung in the air, aching with emptiness. Before I could ask more, I heard the distant slam of a car door on my side of the fence. Panic surged through me. I scrambled to my feet, brushing grass from my knees. "I have to go," I whispered. He nodded. "Go, and be careful." I ran into the house just as my father walked into the kitchen. He studied me, eyes narrowed, as though trying to read the truth straight off my skin. I kept my head low, my hands tucked behind me, the wooden bird pressed against my palm. That night when I lay in bed, I held the bird to my chest and closed my eyes. Raymond's voice echoed through my mind, soft and steady, a kind of lullaby born from longing. Somewhere deep inside me, a truth began to unfurl, quiet, tentative, but undeniable. This man, the one my parents loathed, saw me more clearly than either of them ever had. And though I couldn't explain why I felt drawn to him with a loyalty I didn't yet understand, I didn't know then that he had been waiting for me long before I was old enough to walk. I didn't know he was watching my life from behind shadows of grief and guilt. But I felt something, a connection, a thread, a question that would change everything. Why does he look at me like he's remembering something precious? I fell asleep clutching the wooden bird, unaware that the truth behind that look would one day shatter everything I believed about who I was and where I came from. I was 16 the first time I stood on Raymond Kessler's front steps, my hand hovering over the doorknob, my pulse drumming hard enough to shake my ribs. Until that day, every moment we shared had been filtered through the narrow opening beneath the fence, a secret world small enough to fit inside a child's imagination. But childhood was slipping away from me fast and quietly, and something inside me ached for more than whispered conversations through a sliver of wood. I wanted to see him without barriers. I wanted to understand why he sometimes looked at me as though he were remembering a life he'd once lived. The sky was a pale winter blue that afternoon, cold and clean. I had used my new driver's license as an excuse to slip out of the house. My parents barely noticed my comings and goings anymore. They were preoccupied with their own battles, silent or otherwise. I parked around the corner so they wouldn't hear the engine or glance out the window and spot me. My breath fogged in front of me as I walked up the walkway to Raymond's porch. For a moment I hesitated, my hand shaking in midair, wondering if I was doing something irrevocable. But I knocked, softly at first, then with more courage. Footsteps shuffled inside. The door opened an inch, then fully, and there he was. The man my parents had called dangerous. The man who had given me candy and carved wooden birds with trembling hands. The man who sometimes said my name so gently it made my throat tighten. His eyes widened when he saw me. "Evelyn," he breathed, his voice, half wonder, half fear. "What are you doing here? I wanted to see you," I said. "For real. Not through the fence." He looked over my shoulder toward my house. His jaw tightened. "Your parents would be furious." "I don't care." He studied my face as though searching for hesitation. When he found none, something in him softened. "Come in," he whispered. I stepped into his home for the first time, and the world shifted. The air smelled like pine and old books and Earl Grey tea. Every wall was lined with shelves overflowing with novels, maps, journals, and worn paperbacks whose spines had been cracked open 100 times. Photos hung in mismatched frames, mountain ranges, city streets, oceans, sunrises, each one a window into a world he had once walked. I had never been in a place that felt so lived in, so full of story. My house had always felt like a display, clean, coordinated, stiff void of warmth. But Raymond's home felt like someone's heart. He motioned for me to sit on a large yellowing couch, then shuffled to the kitchen. I heard a kettle whistle. Moments later, he returned with 2 steaming mugs of tea. I imagined this moment, he admitted quietly, settling into the armchair across from me. "Seeing you here. Face to face." "Me too," I whispered. We sat in silence for a few seconds, studying each other without a fence between us. His eyes were tired, rimmed with age, but they held a depth I never saw in my parents, a mix of sorrow and pride and something like longing. "You've grown," he said softly. "So have you," I teased gently. He laughed, the sound warm and crackling. I took a sip of tea and glanced around the room, absorbing everything. A small cat I'd never seen before stretched on the windowsill, tail twitching lazily. Blankets lay folded with care. A carved wooden box sat on the coffee table, polished and intricate. "It's cozy," I said. "It's lonely," he corrected, then gave a small smile. "But it's mine." The honesty in his voice made me exhale slowly. My own home was neither cozy nor lonely. It was tense, rigid, a place where words were measured and affection rationed. I felt safer here than I ever had in the house I grew up in. I told him about school, about my favorite teachers, about the essays I'd written on the Revolutionary War. He listened with an attentiveness that made me want to keep talking, keep offering pieces of myself. When I told him I wanted to study history in college, he leaned back, eyes shimmering. "I knew you would," he said. "How? Because you crave truth, even when others try to hide it from you." The comment pinched something inside me. I didn't understand how accurately he saw me or why it felt both comforting and terrifying. I let my gaze wander again, settling on a framed photograph above his desk. A young man stood in the photo, smiling broadly, holding a swaddled infant in his arms. Beside him was a woman with dark hair and gentle eyes. The three of them glowed with undeniable joy. I pointed. "Who's that?" He stiffened. "That was a long time ago," he murmured. "They look happy." "Yes," he said quietly. "They were. Is the baby he cut me off softly? A grandchild. Someone I lost." The room felt suddenly smaller. My pulse sped. "I'm sorry," I whispered. He nodded but didn't elaborate. His gaze drifted to the floor shoulders, sagging beneath an invisible weight. I had the sudden urge to cross the room and hug him, something I'd never felt with my own parents. As the silence stretched, he cleared his throat and forced a smile. "Tell me more about your studies." We talked for hours about books, about courage, about choices that ripple through time. He asked me about my dreams, and when I hesitated, unsure how to voice them, he said, "You don't have to be afraid of wanting more than what you were given." Something broke inside me then. I felt tears prick my eyes, which embarrassed me, but he didn't look surprised. "I see the way you dim yourself," he said tenderly. "You don't have to do that here." My breath trembled. "I don't know how to be any different." "You will," he murmured. "With time. With truth." I wanted to ask what truth he meant, but before I could, I noticed the door at the end of the hall slightly ajar. Inside, I glimpsed a desk piled with letters, a half-open album, and a wooden chest with the letter K carved on top. "What's in there?" I asked. He turned sharply. "You shouldn't go in that room." His voice wasn't harsh, it was frightened. "Why?" I whispered. "Because you're not ready." He pushed himself to his feet and closed the door gently, as though sealing something fragile, something dangerous. His hands shook slightly when he returned to his chair. "I'm sorry," I said. "No, sweetheart," he replied, voice soft again. "I'm the one who's sorry. There are things I've wanted to show you since the day you were born." He stopped. His face blanched. I froze. "Since I was born?" He inhaled sharply, regretting the slip. "I misspoke," he said quickly. "I only meant since the day you first spoke to me." But the tremor in his voice betrayed him. A knot tightened in my chest. The conversation drifted to lighter things after that. But the air between us was different, charged with questions neither of us dared put into words. When the light outside began to fade, I stood reluctantly. "I should go," I said. He rose slowly, walking me to the door. His hand brushed mine for the briefest second, warm, trembling, familiar. "Thank you for visiting me," he whispered. "It meant more than you know." I turned toward the driveway, but before I stepped off the porch, he said my name. I faced him again. His eyes glimmered in the soft evening light. "If one day you learn something painful," he said, "something that shakes the ground beneath you, promise me you'll remember this feeling." "What feeling?" "That you were loved." My throat tightened, unable to respond. He added softly, "More than you'll ever understand." I didn't know what he meant, not yet. But the words burrowed deep, planting themselves like seeds that would grow roots in the darkest moments of my future. As I got into my car and drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Raymond was still standing on the porch, watching me with an expression so full of longing it nearly broke me. At the time, I thought he was simply an old man grateful for company. I didn't know he was looking at his granddaughter. I didn't know he was hoping for one more chance before the truth shattered everything. I didn't know he was trying to memorize me, because he feared one day I might disappear from his life the way his son once had. If I had known then, maybe I would have turned back. Maybe I would have asked him what he meant. Maybe I would have saved both of us years of ache. But at 16, I only knew the smallest fragment of the truth. And I had no idea the rest of it was waiting in the shadows, gathering strength, preparing to break open the world I thought I understood. By the time I turned 18, the seasons in Providence had begun to change faster than I could keep pace with them, and so had Raymond. I noticed it first in his breathing, the quiet hitch between sentences when he tried to tell me a story. Then in the way his hands trembled slightly when he poured tea, or how he sometimes lost his place in a book he'd read a dozen times. It was subtle, almost delicate the way age crept into him. But once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. It pressed into my chest every time I walked up his porch steps. One afternoon in early November, I found him in his living room staring out the window, as if trying to remember what the world looked like in color. He didn't hear me enter. When I finally spoke his name, he turned slowly, as though waking from a dream. He wasn't ready to leave. "You scared me," he whispered, but there was a smile behind his words. "You okay?" I asked, studying the way he sank back into his chair. "Just tired. Happens more often these days." I sat beside him, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The quiet between us had never been uncomfortable before. But today it felt weighted like a truth waiting at the edge of a cliff. His eyes drifted toward me soft, but clouded. "You've grown into a remarkable young woman, Evelyn." I laughed lightly. "You say that every year. I mean it every year." He lifted a trembling hand, then lowered it again, as if unsure whether he had the right to touch me. The gesture twisted something deep in my ribs. A few minutes passed before he said almost to himself, "I'm afraid I won't get to see everything you'll become." I blinked, startled. "Don't talk like that." His smile was faint. "We don't get to choose how much time we're given, only what we do with it." A chill crept across my spine. I wanted to tell him he wasn't that old, that he'd be around for years, but even at 18 I knew when someone was pretending not to be afraid. He changed the subject. "How are your parents?" I shrugged. "Worse. They barely talk to each other. And when they do, it's like they're trying to win a war neither of them remembers starting. And you, I stay out of the way." He exhaled slowly. "You shouldn't have to. But I do." He looked at me with a sorrow so deep it made my throat tighten. "They don't see you, Evelyn. Not the way they should." I didn't know how to answer that. So I didn't. Instead, I let silence wrap around us again, warm and fragile. It was after that conversation that the slips in his memory became harder to ignore. One afternoon he called me by the name Eliza. I didn't understand. "Who's Eliza?" He blinked, startled as though waking from a dream. I'm sorry. I misspoke." "But you keep saying it," I whispered. "Who was she?" He looked away, jaw tightening. "Someone I loved." "Did she die?" A pause. "Yes," he said softly. "A very long time ago." He didn't explain further, and I didn't push him. But I saw the grief flicker across his face, sharp and unmistakable, as though her memory were tied to something he had never forgiven himself for. As winter approached, his health seemed to slip between my fingers like melting ice. His steps slowed. His voice rasped. Sometimes mid-sentence he drifted away, eyes going distant, before returning abruptly, apologetically. "I'm sorry," he'd mumble. "My mind wanders." "It's okay," I always told him. But it wasn't okay. Not to me. One windy afternoon, when leaves scratched against the windows like old secrets trying to claw their way in, I arrived to find him sitting on the floor beside his bookshelf, papers scattered around him. Panic surged through me. "Raymond." I rushed to his side. "What happened?" He looked up confused. I was looking for something, but I can't remember what. I helped him to his feet, feeling how much weight he had lost. He leaned on me more than he realized. "You should rest. I don't have time to rest." The sharpness in his voice startled me. "What do you mean?" I asked. He looked at me with urgency, his eyes suddenly clear, painfully clear. "I should have told you years ago. I should have found a way to do it before now." Told me what his breath faltered. "The truth. About your parents. About me." My stomach clenched. "Raymond." "What truth?" But his eyes flickered again, the clarity fading, and he slumped back into his chair, exhausted. "Not now," he whispered. "I'm not ready." I wasn't ready either. But I wanted to be. The next evening, the consequences of our secrecy edged closer than either of us expected. As I slipped into his yard through the side gate, a route I used when I didn't want to risk being seen, my mother stepped into the kitchen window at the exact moment I passed by. Her eyes widened, her face draining of color. I ducked instinctively, heart pounding, but the damage was done. When I returned home, she was waiting. "Where were you?" she demanded. "Library?" I lied. She stepped closer, gripping the counter so tightly her knuckles whitened. "I saw you." My heart hammered. "Saw me what? Don't lie to me, Evelyn. I saw you near his house." I froze. My father appeared behind her, his shoulders tense. "You disobeyed us." I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. My mother's voice broke. "Do you understand how dangerous he is? How much we've tried to protect you?" "Protect me from what?" I shot back. "He's never done anything to hurt me." "You don't know what he's capable of," my father snapped. "Then tell me," I cried. "What did he do? Why do you hate him?" They both fell silent. My mother closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Some things you're better off not knowing." My father's face twisted, not with anger but with panic. "Stay away from him," he said, his voice shaking. "If you know what's best for you, stay away." I ran to my room, slamming the door behind me. For the first time in my life, I felt a crack of doubt, not about Raymond, but about them. What were they hiding? Why did the idea of me knowing the truth terrify them so much? The next week, Raymond seemed even weaker. He forgot the titles of his favorite books. He asked me the same question twice within minutes. One day, as we sat together at his dining table, he suddenly reached for my hand. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "For what?" "For not being there the way I should have been. For not telling you sooner. For letting fear guide my life." My pulse quickened. "Raymond, are you talking about my parents?" His eyes shimmered with pain. "I made choices long ago that set everything in motion. Tell me," I pleaded. "Tell me what happened." He shook his head. "Not yet. But soon. Before it's too late." A chill spread through me. Too late for what I asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he asked me about college, what I wanted to study, where I hoped to go. I told him I'd been accepted to Providence College, that I wanted to live close enough to keep visiting him. At this, something like gratitude washed over his face. "I'm glad," he said softly. "I want to see you grow into who you're meant to be. I come here because you believe in me," I admitted. "No one else does." His eyes softened. "Of course I believe in you." Then after a pause, he added quietly, "You're my greatest joy, Evelyn." I felt those words sink into me like sunlight warming a place long left cold, but even that warmth couldn't quiet the fear rising in my chest. Something was happening to him, something I was powerless to stop. On my last visit before starting college, he walked me to the porch as always. But this time he clutched the railing, his breath thin and ragged. "You shouldn't strain yourself," I said, worried. He shook his head. "Let me look at you." I turned toward him, and his gaze swept over my face with such tenderness that my throat tightened. "If I'm not here when you come back," he whispered, "I want you to remember one thing." My breath caught. "What? That the darkness your parents fear is just the truth, and the truth will set you free." I stared at him, stunned. "Raymond, what does that mean?" He reached for my hand. "You'll understand when the time comes." I wanted to demand answers. I wanted to refuse to leave until he told me everything. But the look on his face stopped me, a look of exhaustion, of resignation, of love. I stepped off the porch, turning back once more. He stood there in the fading light, silhouetted against the yellow glow of the doorway, his hand lifted in a trembling wave. I didn't know then that it would be one of the last times I ever saw him alive. I didn't know that the truth he'd been guarding for decades was already waiting for me, packed away in a box in the darkness of his attic. And I didn't know that everything I loved, everything I feared, everything I believed about my family was about to be swept into a storm I could no longer avoid. But I felt it, in the heaviness of his breath, in the shakiness of his touch, in the quiet desperation behind his final smile. Something was coming, something that would change my life forever. The funeral was held on a Thursday morning in late October, the kind of cold, brittle morning when the world feels like it's holding its breath. Frost clung to the grass like a thin layer of glass. The trees stood nearly bare, their branches rattling softly in the wind. It felt wrong somehow to bury a man who had given me warmth on a day so bitter and gray. I stood alone at the edge of St. Mark's Cemetery, my hands shoved into the pockets of my coat, watching two workers lower Raymond's casket into the ground. There were no mourners, no flowers except the ones the funeral home placed as part of the basic package, no hymns, no whispered condolences, no faces lined with loss. Just me. And the priest flipping through his prayer book with the mechanical detachment of someone who had done this 1,000 times for strangers he would never know. I didn't cry at first. I felt suspended, too numb to understand grief, too old to sob like a child, too young to make sense of what it meant to lose the only truly steady presence in my life. The priest murmured his final blessing. The workers tightened the straps. The casket descended slowly, disappearing inch by inch beneath the earth. A rush of cold wind blew across my face and something in me cracked. He was gone. Raymond was truly gone. A man who had spent 35 years living behind a fence just to be close to me. A man who waited for me on summer afternoons and carved me wooden birds with initials he never explained. A man who looked at me sometimes as if he were memorizing the shape of my face, because it reminded him of someone he had loved. I knelt beside the grave, pressing my glove against the loose dirt. "I'm here," I whispered. I stayed. "I'm still here." My breath fogged in the morning air. "I'm sorry you were alone." My voice trembled on the final word, and then all at once the tears came hot, heavy, unstoppable. Not polite tears, not quiet ones, but deep sobs pulled from a place I had spent a lifetime trying to hide. I cried for him. I cried for myself. I cried for the years we lost to lies I didn't yet understand. The workers lingered awkwardly until I nodded for them to leave. The priest shook my hand with a rehearsed expression of sympathy. And suddenly I was alone again, surrounded by silence, staring at a fresh mound of earth that felt impossibly final. I stayed until the wind turned sharper, until my legs ached from kneeling, until the cemetery groundskeeper started glancing toward me, as if worried I might bury myself beside him out of grief. When I finally stood brushing dirt from my knees, a man in a charcoal suit stepped forward from the shadow of a nearby oak. He looked young, maybe around 30, with hair too neat, and a leather briefcase clasped tightly in his hand. His shoes were damp from the frosted grass. "Ms. Ward?" he asked cautiously. "Yes?" He swallowed, adjusting his grip on the briefcase. "My name is Thomas Hale. I was Mr. Kessler's attorney. Raymond had an attorney." The idea struck me strangely. A lonely man with no family, no visitors, no one to attend his funeral, yet he had taken the time to prepare legal paperwork. Something about that made my skin prickle. Thomas gestured toward the grave. "I wasn't sure you would come." "Why?" He offered a sad, almost knowing smile. "He said you would be the only one." My breath caught. "He told you about me?" "Yes." Thomas reached slowly into his briefcase and withdrew a large sealed envelope. He left strict instructions. "I was to give this to you personally. No one else." My gloved fingers hesitated. "What is it, his final letter?" Thomas said gently. "And the key to his house. He designated you as his sole beneficiary." It took several seconds for his words to settle. Beneficiary. That doesn't make sense. I wasn't. He watched me with careful eyes. "He wanted you to know the truth. All of it." My heart lurched. There it was again, that word. Truth. The one he had whispered to me on his porch. The one he'd guarded like a fragile secret. The one my parents seemed terrified would ever reach me. I looked at the grave, the damp soil darkening under my feet. Is this about why my parents hated him? Thomas didn't answer. He didn't have to. His silence made everything louder. He pressed the envelope into my hand. "You should read it somewhere private." I stared at my name handwritten across the front, Evelyn. The ink was slightly smudged as if his hand had trembled while writing it. "I'm sorry for your loss," Thomas added quietly before stepping back. "He cared for you more than you know." Before I could respond, he turned and walked toward the gate, his dark figure dissolving into the pale morning fog. I clutched the envelope to my chest, suddenly terrified to open it. My breath felt thin, brittle. I understood in that moment what he had meant when he told me the truth would free me and break me. I walked to my car on unsteady legs, driving aimlessly, until instinct led me to a place neither memory nor logic guided. A small overlook above the river, quiet except for rustling leaves and water folding gently against the shoreline. I sat in the driver's seat, fingers trembling as I peeled open the seal. Inside was a single handwritten letter and a brass house key tied to a faded piece of ribbon. And when I unfolded the letter, I saw his handwriting shaky, familiar, full of pauses and cross-outs, as though he had rewritten the same sentence 100 times before surrendering to truth. My dearest Evelyn, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and it means I failed to tell you in life what you deserved to know from the moment you were born. My breath caught, the paper blurred. I blinked hard and kept reading. I am writing now because love gives courage that fear never could, and my love for you has been the one constant light in my life for 35 years. 35 years. The exact amount of time he had lived next door. My heart thudded painfully. Your parents told you I was dangerous. They built fences to keep you from me. They filled your childhood with fear of a man who had never harmed anyone. But they did it because they knew the truth, and they were terrified you might discover it. My fingers clenched the page. Every breath hurt. Evelyn, I am your grandfather. The world seemed to tilt. A ringing filled my ears. I read the line again and again. Grandfather. He wrote the next part carefully, as though afraid the words might wound me more than they healed. Your father, whose name was once Daniel Kessler, is my son. I felt a shock of cold run down my spine. He continued each sentence, tightening the knot in my stomach. When Daniel was 23, he committed a terrible act. A hit and run. A woman lost her life. 2 children lost their mother. I froze. He fled the scene. And for weeks afterward he lived in fear until he finally confessed to me. My heart hammered. I begged him to turn himself in. I told him that redemption begins with truth. But he refused. He told me that if I spoke a word of it, he would disappear, change his name, cut me off, erase me from his life. You know now that he meant it. My eyes stung as I read the next line. He left me and I lost my only child. My breath trembled. My father had never mentioned any of this. He had never spoken of a past life, of a different name, of a tragedy that had shaped the man he became. Raymond continued, his handwriting growing less steady. When I learned he had married, and that you had been born, I knew I couldn't lose you too. I pressed a hand to my mouth, tears slipping down my wrist. So I sold everything I owned and bought the house next door. I have watched you grow from the moment you first opened your eyes. A sob escaped me. He wrote more. I carved birds for you long before you could walk. I spoke to you through the fence because it was the only way your father allowed me to love you. Every gift I passed through that sliver of wood was a prayer that one day you would know who you truly are. My vision blurred completely. I kept reading. In my attic is a box labeled The Truth. Inside are documents, letters, photos, everything you need to understand what happened the night Daniel changed all our lives. And then the final line. I am proud of you, Evelyn. I always have been. You were never alone. You were always loved. Your grandfather, Raymond Kessler. I sat in the car for a long time, the letter trembling in my hands. Everything I thought I knew about my family, about my childhood, about the man behind the fence, shifted beneath me. He wasn't dangerous. He wasn't a stranger. He wasn't the villain of my parents' stories. He was my grandfather, and my father was hiding something monstrous. I looked at the key tied to the ribbon, feeling its weight, his last gift to me, a key to the home he had built around longing, a key to the truth waiting in his attic. And I knew with sudden clarity that nothing in my life would ever be the same again. The house felt different the first time I entered it after Raymond's death, like the air itself had paused, waiting for me to breathe life back into rooms that had stood still for weeks. I unlocked the front door with the brass key tied to the faded ribbon and stepped inside. The smell hit me, first pine dust, and something softer, something I could only describe as him. My throat tightened as I closed the door behind me. I walked slowly through the living room, touching the back of his favorite armchair, tracing the edges of his bookshelves, remembering the way he used to sit with a blanket over his knees, ready to listen to whatever story I brought him. The silence inside the house wasn't empty laughter or cold absence. It felt haunted with love. I crossed into the hallway, pausing at the framed photographs he'd never taken down. Landscapes, distant mountains, rivers he'd once stood beside. A younger version of himself sitting atop a stone wall in a small town in Vermont. And then the photo I hadn't noticed the first time I visited, a zoomed shot of a little girl playing in her backyard. Me. I stared at it for a long time. His handwriting on the back was faint, Evelyn, age 7. First time I heard her laugh. My breath shook. My chest felt too small to contain the grief and tenderness swelling inside it. But the letter had been clear. The truth was waiting in the attic. I moved through the hallway to the narrow staircase just beyond the kitchen. With each step the air grew cooler, the light dimmer. The wooden stairs creaked beneath my weight. I reached the top landing where a single window let in a thin gray beam of daylight. Dust floated through it like drifting ash. The attic door was closed. It felt wrong to open it without knocking. So I did. A soft, pointless rap one that broke the quiet. Of course no one answered. I wrapped my fingers around the old brass knob and turned it slowly. The door groaned, the sound echoing through the narrow space. The smell inside was older, deeper cardboard cedar notebooks, whose spines had long since loosened. I stepped inside. The attic was cluttered with decades of his life. Boxes lined the walls labeled in his patient handwriting, winter clothes, old books, photos, travel journals. But one box sat apart from the others, centered on the floor as though waiting for me. The truth. Just seeing the words made my knees weaken. The cardboard was worn soft from years of being moved or handled or considered. He must have opened it often, maybe reread its contents, maybe wondered who would carry this burden when he no longer could. I knelt beside it and hesitated, my hand hovering over the lid. I whispered to the quiet room, "I'll read it, Raymond. I'll know everything you wanted me to know." When I lifted the lid, the dust stirred like breath. Inside were stacks of documents, photographs, letters wrapped in string, and a few items I didn't recognize. I lifted a newspaper clipping from the top. The edges had yellowed with age. The headline struck me like a blow, "Hit and Run Claims Life of Local Mother." The date, June 9th, 35 years ago. My vision blurred as I scanned the article. A woman named Maria Ortiz, age 31, struck by a vehicle while crossing a residential street. Witnesses reported seeing a young man fleeing the scene. A blue sedan. No plates clearly visible. She left behind 2 children ages 5 and 8. My voice cracked as I whispered, "Oh God." The next item was a series of photos, grainy prints of a car with a crumpled front bumper. A younger version of my father stood near the vehicle, half hidden the photo, taken from a distance, as if Raymond had been afraid to get closer. Then I found a handwritten letter. My father's handwriting, sharp, slanted, unmistakable. "Dad, I don't know what to do. I'm terrified. I can't sleep. I see her every time I close my eyes. Please don't tell anyone. I'll lose everything." I pressed the letter to my forehead, shaking. I wanted to drop it. I wanted to burn it. I wanted to scream. I kept reading. Please, Dad, I'm begging you. I'll do better. I'll change. I just can't face prison. I'll disappear if you go to the police. Tears streamed down my face. I could see him writing it, frantic, selfish, desperate. The next letter was written in my grandfather's familiar, steady script. Daniel, you must turn yourself in. A woman is dead. Her children deserve justice. Running will not save you. It will destroy you and everyone you love. The next note was shorter, jagged, almost violent in its strokes. If you tell anyone, I will never speak to you again. I will change my name. You will never meet your grandchild. My entire body went cold. I whispered the name quietly, Daniel. My father had been Daniel Kessler. He had reinvented himself as Daniel Ward. He had severed his own origins like a diseased limb, dragging us into a life built on cowardice. For a long moment I knelt there, trembling, unable to breathe, unable to think. The attic seemed to tilt around me as if the truth itself had weight. When I could finally move again, I lifted the second stack of items from the box. Inside was a small envelope with decades-old postage. It was addressed to my granddaughter, Evelyn. To be opened when you are ready. My breath hitched. I opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a simple piece of paper on which he had written, I have loved you every day of your life. Just that. No more. I wiped my tears with the back of my hand, feeling the ache spread slowly through every part of me. Beneath the envelope was a stack of photos, dozens of them. Me from different ages, playing in the yard, riding a bike, walking home from school, sitting on the porch with a book. He had watched me grow up from a distance, capturing moments he could never share. The final item in the box was a police report Raymond must have requested copies long after the case went cold. Attached was a list of witness accounts, a description of the vehicle, a map of the street where the accident occurred, a street not far from where my parents once lived before I was born. I sat back on the wooden floor, the truth heavy in my lap like a second heartbeat. My tears wouldn't stop. My chest felt too tight to contain all the grief and anger swelling inside it. I whispered into the silence, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" But I already knew the answer. My parents. My father had threatened to disappear if Raymond told anyone, and my mother, whether out of loyalty or fear, had chosen to stand beside him. They had buried a woman's death beneath layers of lies. They had stolen a grandfather from his granddaughter. They had chosen the comfort of silence over the price of truth. And Raymond, he had chosen love. Love at a distance. Love through a fence. Love in the shape of wooden birds and quiet conversations. Love without expectation, without permission, without the right to claim his own blood. The wound of it all opened wider the longer I sat there. Eventually, I forced myself to put everything back into the box, neatly, carefully, as though handling an injured thing, and carried it downstairs into the living room. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, catching dust motes that danced like ash around me. I sank into his armchair, holding the box to my chest. I wasn't ready to confront my father. Not yet. The truth trembled through me like an earthquake, and I needed time to understand it, to gather strength, to shape anger into purpose. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty: I could never look at him the same way again, not knowing what he'd done, not knowing how many years he'd stolen from the man who loved me, not knowing how many lies he'd let harden into the foundation of my life. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room. I let my eyes drift toward the wall of photos, toward the ones he had taken of me when I was too young to know I was being watched with love. I whispered to the quiet house, "You didn't lose me, Raymond. Not anymore." For the first time in my life, I understood that family wasn't defined by the people who raised you. It was defined by the ones who loved you in the dark when no one else did. I sat there until the last light faded, holding the truth like a promise. And when I finally stood to leave, I carried the box with me, not because I needed proof, but because I needed courage for what came next. My parents were going to hear everything, and I wasn't going to whisper anymore. I drove to my parents' house the next evening with the box on the passenger seat beside me, its cardboard corners worn, its contents pulsing like a second heartbeat beneath the lid. Streetlights flickered on one by one as dusk settled over Providence, turning the quiet neighborhood into a stage lit only for the truth. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my wrists, my fingertips. Everything inside me trembled, not with fear exactly, but with a kind of righteous fury I'd never known before. This was the night I would stop pretending. This was the night their silence would end. When I pulled into the driveway, the familiar ache returned, the emptiness of that house, the cold windows, the rigid lawn that never seemed to grow out of place. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, remembering that I had spent my entire childhood believing this was what stability looked like, but now I knew it had been built on lies polished by denial. I picked up the box. I walked up the front steps, and I knocked. My mother opened the door first. She wore a cardigan I didn't recognize, her hair pinned up too tightly as if she'd been expecting company. But when she saw me and saw the box in my hands, her expression sank into something brittle. "Evelyn," she breathed. "You're early. I'm not here for dinner." Her eyes dropped to the box as if it were a weapon. "Oh," she whispered. My father stepped into the hallway behind her. His face looked older than I remembered from just a few months earlier, lined with something I couldn't name: guilt, fear, recognition. He saw the box and froze. Everything inside him went still. For a moment, none of us spoke. "Where's the dining room?" I asked, my voice steady. My mother swallowed hard. "Evelyn, whatever you're thinking, dining room," I repeated. She stepped aside with a shudder. I walked in, placed the box squarely in the center of the polished oak table, my childhood battlefield, where arguments simmered under silverware and politeness, and I took the seat at the head. A place they'd never let me sit before. My parents stood across from me, not daring to sit. I lifted the lid of the box, deliberately exposing the newspaper clippings, the photos, the letter in my father's handwriting. "Let's talk," I said. My father's jaw tightened. "Where did you get that?" I looked at him. Really looked. At the face of the man who had raised me, disciplined me, taught me to fear a man who had loved me. "From my grandfather," I answered. My mother inhaled sharply. My father's face drained of color. "He's never been my father," began. "He is my grandfather," I cut in. "You lied about that for 35 years. My father looked at my mother silently, begging for support. She pressed her lips together, her eyes glistening. "I read the letter," I said, pulling it from the top of the box and laying it flat on the table. "He told me everything." My father's shoulders slumped as if a blow had struck him squarely. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to meet his eyes. Why did you do it?" My father closed his eyes for a long moment before speaking. "It was a mistake," he whispered. "No," I said firmly. "A mistake is forgetting your keys. A mistake is turning left when you meant to turn right. What you did," I slid the article across the table toward him, "was a crime." His hand trembled as he touched the brittle newsprint, his fingers recoiling like it burned him. "I didn't mean," he tried again. "You left her there," I said, feeling my throat tighten. "You left a woman dying in the street. You ran. And then you let her children grow up believing no one cared enough to tell them the truth." He flinched. My mother finally spoke, her voice thin. "You don't understand what it was like. He was young. He was terrified." So he changed his name, erased his past. "Cut out the only parent who loved him," I asked sharply. "Tell me which part of that was fear and which part was selfishness." My father swallowed hard. I was going to lose everything. "You should have," I said. He stared at me, stunned. "You should have faced consequences," I repeated. "You should have gone to jail. You should have stood in front of her family and told them the truth. Instead, you chose the one thing that protected only you." He looked down at the table. My mother sat slowly, her hands shaking. "We built a good life for you." "No," I whispered. You built a lie. Around me. Around us. She pressed her palms to her face, crying silently. I reached into the box and pulled out the first photo I found my father as a young man standing beside the dented car Raymond had photographed. I placed it in front of him. He stared at it for a long time. I could have lost everything he said again. Voice strained. You should have lost everything, I said. A woman did lose everything. Her children lost their mother. You walked away, and you kept walking for 35 years. He shook his head. I changed. I became a good man. No, I said, my voice cracking. You became a careful man. A man who lied to survive. A man who punished his own father for trying to do the right thing. A man who stole my grandfather from me. My mother let out a pained sob at that. My father's eyes softened with something like regret. I didn't want you near him. I didn't want you learning the truth. And why not? His voice dropped to a whisper. Because I didn't want you to hate me. That single sentence stunned me into silence. For the first time, I saw him not as the rigid man who controlled everything in our house, but as someone who had spent his entire adult life terrified his past would crawl out of the shadows. Did you ever think, I asked softly, about what that fear cost him? What it cost me? He closed his eyes. I didn't know how to fix it, he whispered. You could have begun with the truth, I said. My hand hovered over the box again, and I lifted a stack of pictures of me taken over the years from Raymond's window. My first day of kindergarten, riding my bike, drawing chalk on the sidewalk, laughing with my hair in pigtails. I scattered them across the table. My mother gasped. This is what you took from me, I said softly. A man who adored me. A man who watched me grow up from a distance because his son threatened to disappear if he dared speak to me. My father finally broke. Tears spilled down his cheeks, the first I'd ever seen in my entire life. He sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands, shoulders heaving. I didn't know how to make it right, he said through trembling fingers. And the longer I waited, the harder it became. And so you did nothing, I whispered. He nodded, ashamed. You let him die alone, I said. You let him believe you hated him. You stole his family, his name, his right to watch his granddaughter grow up. My father shook his head violently. I never meant to hurt you. But you did, I said quietly. Every day you lied to me. The room fell silent except for the sound of my mother crying softly into her hands. I took a deep breath, gathering the courage to say the next words. I'm going to find her children. My father lifted his head, eyes wide with panic. Evelyn, no. They deserve to know, I said. They deserve answers. They'll come after me, he whispered. They won't have to, I replied. I'm not going to the police. The statute of limitations is gone. But they deserve the truth you never gave them. He slumped back, defeated. It will destroy us. No, I said gently. You destroyed us 35 years ago. I'm trying to rebuild what's left. My mother reached out across the table, but I pulled my hand away. I don't know who you are anymore, I whispered. She sobbed harder. I stood, gathering the box, sliding everything back inside. My father watched me with hollow eyes, as if watching a sentence being written that he knew he deserved. As I walked toward the door, he called after me. Evelyn! I paused. My father loved you, he said hoarsely, more than anyone in the world. I never wanted you to know. Because I knew you'd look at me the way you are right now. I swallowed the lump in my throat. You should have thought of that, I whispered, before you ran that night. His breath hitched. I walked out of the house with the box clutched to my chest. The air outside was cool, quiet, merciful. I stood on the porch, staring into the dark yard, where the 10-foot fence once stood between me and the truth. The fence was gone, but now everything else had to fall too. Tomorrow I would find Maria Ortiz's children. Tomorrow I would show them everything. Tonight I walked to my car feeling lighter and heavier all at once. The truth was free now, and nothing could bury it again. Finding Maria Ortiz's children began as a single desperate search bar on my laptop, typed late at night in the quiet of Raymond's living room, where the shadows of his bookshelves stretched across the floor like patient witnesses. I sat cross-legged on the worn rug, the box of documents open beside me, the soft ticking of the old wall clock marking each second I hesitated. I didn't know what I would say if I found them. I didn't know what kind of wounds I might reopen. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. They deserved the truth. It took less time than I expected. People tend to leave digital footprints behind them, scraps of life scattered like breadcrumbs. It didn't take long to find two names mentioned in an archived obituary for Maria Lucas Ortiz and his younger sister Serena. Lucas was 39 now, a mechanic in Worcester, Massachusetts. Serena was 36, a school nurse in New Bedford. My fingers trembled when I found their addresses. They lived ordinary lives in ordinary towns, but the night their mother died had carved itself into their entire histories. I wondered how many times they'd looked in the mirror and seen the versions of themselves that had grown up too fast. For a moment I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, imagining if it were me, if my mother had died young, if someone had taken her from me, if a stranger had known the truth for decades and stayed silent. Then I picked up my phone. I called Lucas first. The phone rang 3 times before a gruff voice answered. "Yeah, hi," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "Is this Lucas Ortiz? Silence? Who's asking? My name is Evelyn Ward. I have information about your mother." The line went dead quiet. Not silent like confusion, silent like shock. "My mother died 35 years ago," he said slowly. "I know," I whispered. "I know what happened to her. I know who hit her that night. And I have proof." He didn't speak for several seconds. I could hear him breathing, could almost feel him staring into the distance, into the past he'd tried to forget. "Where are you?" he asked finally. We agreed to meet the next day at a coffee shop in New Bedford. Serena would join us. After ending the call, I curled into Raymond's armchair and cried, not because I regretted anything, but because something inside me was shifting, sharp and irrevocable. The next morning I drove down the highway in silence, the box in the passenger seat like a second presence. The leaves along the roadside flashed in bright bursts, orange, yellow, red, distractingly alive for a day so somber. I arrived 15 minutes early and sat in the car watching strangers walk in and out of the small corner cafe. And then I saw them. Lucas tall, broad-shouldered, with dark eyes that scanned every detail around him. And beside him, Serena, slight, wary, clutching her purse, as if bracing for impact. I stepped out of the car and walked toward them, their eyes locked onto the box in my arms. "You're the girl who called us?" Lucas asked. "Yes," I whispered. We moved inside, sitting in a quiet corner of the cafe where the smell of roasted coffee beans softened the tension. I placed the box gently on the table between us. Serena's fingers trembled. "Why now?" she asked. "Why, after all these years?" "Because," I began, my voice shaky, "the man who kept the truth from you is dead. And the man who wanted you to know, he never got the chance." I opened the box. The first thing I pulled out was the police report, then the newspaper clipping, then the photo of the damaged car, and finally the letter from my father to Raymond, the confession he'd written in fear and selfishness. Lucas reached for the letter with a shaking hand, scanning the words, his jaw tightening. Serena covered her mouth with her hand, tears slipping from her eyes before she even noticed they'd begun to fall. "This is him," Lucas whispered. "This is the man who killed her." "Yes," I said softly. Serena wiped her cheeks. "And who are you?" I swallowed hard. "His daughter." Their eyes widened in the same moment. Serena leaned forward, searching my face for something familiar, something inherited. Lucas sat back, trying to reconcile the woman in front of him with the man who had stolen so much from their childhood. "I didn't know," I said. "Not until his father, my grandfather, left me everything after he passed away." "And he kept the proof?" Lucas asked, brows furrowed. He spent decades trying to convince my father to turn himself in, I said. And when he wouldn't, he moved next door to me just to watch me grow up. Serena gasped softly. He loved you. Yes, he did. A heavy silence settled between us, thick with grief and disbelief. Lucas looked down at the letter again. My sister and I were 5 and 8 when our mother died. We waited. We prayed someone would be caught. But no one ever was. I know, I whispered. We had to move in with our Aunt Serena added. Our father, he drank himself to death. He couldn't survive the grief. My heart clenched. All the pieces of truth, the horror, the loss, the shattered lives pressed into me like sharp stones. Finally, Lucas lifted his head and met my eyes. What do you want from us? He asked. Nothing, I said. You don't owe me forgiveness. I just wanted you to know the truth. I wanted you to have what my grandfather died believing you deserved. Lucas breathed deeply, the kind of breath that shakes free a lifetime of tension. Serena touched the photo of the car gently. What about your father, will he? No, I said quietly. He won't face legal charges. It's too late for that, but people deserve to know who he really is. Lucas nodded slowly. We will take this to court, a civil suit at least. And the press. I know, I said. Serena looked at me again, searching. Are you afraid of what will happen to your family? My family, I whispered, was broken long before today. They exchanged a glance that held both sorrow and understanding. I am sorry for what he did, I added softly. I know it doesn't change anything, but I needed you to hear it from someone who isn't lying anymore. Lucas extended his hand across the table, not in friendship, not in forgiveness, in acknowledgement. I took it. When we parted, Serena hugged me briefly, an unexpected gesture, warm and trembling. Thank you, she whispered. On the drive home, the world seemed sharper. Trees, clouds, the hum of the tires on asphalt, all of it humming with the strange electricity that follows a collision of past and present. By the time I reached Providence again, the news had already spread. Articles online, rumors at the edge of every conversation. My phone buzzed with calls and texts, numbers I didn't recognize, reporters, extended family members who rarely spoke to me, coworkers from the school. And then a call from my mother. I let it ring twice before answering. Where are you? She demanded, voice brittle and terrified. Driving home, I said. You need to come here. Now. I can't, I replied. I'm not going back there. Her breath caught. Do you know what you've done? What this will do to your father? Yes, I said, and I know what he did to them. Silence. Then quietly, he's falling apart. Evelyn, he fell apart 35 years ago, I said softly. She didn't reply. I arrived at Raymond's house, my house now, and stepped inside, closing the door behind me. The quiet wrapped around me like a long exhale. His books, his photos, the fading scent of pine. It all felt like a sanctuary carved from the wreckage of truth. I sat in his armchair again. This time I wasn't shaking. This time I didn't feel like a frightened child unearthing secrets too large for her hands. This time I felt something I hadn't felt in years, steady, clear, whole. When the evening light fell across the floorboards, I whispered into the empty room, I did it, Raymond. They know. They finally know. For the first time since he'd been buried, I felt something warm settle inside me. Not peace, exactly, but purpose. And that was enough. Tomorrow, everything would change: my father's reputation, my mother's trust, my own place in the story. But tonight, in the quiet house of the man who had loved me from a distance, I let myself breathe. The fallout began like a slow leak, one that no one noticed until the damage was too big to hide. 2 days after meeting Lucas and Serena, the first article appeared small, tucked into the local section of a Providence paper. But within hours it spread, picked up by statewide outlets, then regional ones, then national media, hungry for a story about hidden guilt, a decades-old tragedy, and a suburban man who had lived under a false name to escape it. The headline felt like a punch to the ribs. Former Providence resident linked to 35-year-old hit and run. My father's real name, Daniel Kessler, was printed below it. His photographs showed a younger version of him standing outside our old home, unaware of the tidal wave waiting for him 35 years in the future. I didn't call my parents. I didn't need to. They called me. At first, my mother's voice was frantic, brittle cracking beneath the weight of a world collapsing faster than she could pick up the pieces. "How could you do this?" she cried. "Do you want to ruin your father, our family?" "What family?" I asked quietly, staring out the window of Raymond's my living room, the one built on lies, the one that kept me from the only real family I had. She choked on a sob. "You don't understand." "I do," I said. "That's the problem." My father called next. His voice wasn't angry, not the way I expected. It was broken, small, hollow. A man standing in the ruins of the life he thought he'd built well enough to withstand time. "You've destroyed everything," he whispered. "No," I said gently. The truth did. He breathed shakily into the receiver. "Did you give them the letter?" "Yes." "And the pictures? All of it?" Silence flooded the line, thick and suffocating. Finally, he said, "I knew this day would come. I just didn't think it would be you." "It was always going to be me," I replied. "Because I'm the one who deserved to know. I'm the one he watched from the window, the one he loved more than anyone." The line trembled. My father whispered, "I never wanted you to hate me." "I don't hate you," I said. "I hate what you did. I hate what you made him endure. I hate that you buried the truth to save yourself." He didn't respond, not with words. The faint, strangled sound on the other end of the line told me everything I needed to know. By the end of the week, reporters stood on the sidewalk outside my parents' house. Cars slowed as they passed. Neighbors whispered on their lawns. The carefully manicured life my parents had cultivated began to unravel thread by thread. My mother moved out on Thursday. She drove away in silence, tears streaking her cheeks, refusing to meet the cameras aimed at her front door. She didn't tell me where she was going. Maybe she didn't know. My father didn't leave the house. He shut the curtains. He stopped answering the phone. Even my mother couldn't reach him after a while. He vanished deeper into himself, into an internal place he'd been building for decades, one shaped by guilt, by fear, by the refusal to face what he had done. Meanwhile, my life tilted into a strange new orbit. Raymond's home became mine in slow, tender steps. I cleaned each room carefully, as though polishing the memory of his presence. I found blankets he'd folded neatly, books he'd marked with little annotations, cups he'd washed and left drying by the sink. It felt wrong to disturb any of it. It felt right to keep all of it. I slept in his guest room, then eventually moved into the master bedroom where the morning sun streamed in through linen curtains he'd sewn himself. In the closet, I found sweaters that still smelled faintly of cedar and peppermint. I pressed my face into them more than once, missing him with an ache that felt like it would swallow me. Every Sunday I visited his grave. I brought tea, flowers, sometimes one of the wooden birds he carved, and I talked. I told him about school, about how my students were learning about early American colonists, about how they argued over who was more at fault in a long-forgotten dispute between English settlers and the Narragansett tribe. He would have loved these debates. He would have said something like, "History is just people trying to make sense of choices they can't undo." One cold afternoon, while placing fresh marigolds on his grave, I felt someone approach behind me. I turned to find Serena standing a few feet away, holding a small white bouquet. "May I?" she asked. I nodded. She knelt beside me, arranging the flowers gently atop the grass. "He wasn't a stranger to us," she said softly. "Now that I know who he was to you, I wanted to pay my respects." "Thank you," I whispered. She looked at me, really looked with a tenderness that surprised me. "It wasn't your burden to fix what your father broke," she said. "But I'm glad you gave us the chance to understand." A tear slipped down my cheek. I wish he had told you himself. I do too, she said. But maybe this was how it was meant to happen. We stayed there a while listening to the wind whisper through the cemetery. Before she left, Serena squeezed my hand. You have a family now, she said. If you want us. The words felt like a balm, like a beginning. My father didn't attend the civil hearing. His attorney handled everything while he stayed hidden behind the front door of the house I had once called home. I attended every session. Lucas and Serena did too. Their stories were heartbreaking lives shaped by a loss impossible to forget. And when my father's confession letter was read aloud in court, the entire room sat in stunned silence. The judge ruled in their favor. My father was ordered to pay damages far beyond anything he could afford. It wasn't justice, not really, but it was acknowledgement, and sometimes acknowledgement is the only form of justice left. Afterward, Lucas approached me. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. You did the right thing, he said. I hope so, I replied. You did. And then he added something I'll never forget. He would be proud of you. Your grandfather. The words hit me like sunlight through a storm. As winter approached, the media frenzy died down, the lawsuits settled, and my parents' house went quiet. I didn't call them. They didn't call me. There was nothing left to say. Raymond's home, in contrast, grew warmer with every passing month. I filled the walls with framed photos, some of him, some of me, some of the two of us together, taken through the fence when I was a child. I restored his garden planting, some of his favorite flowers, foxglove, lavender marigolds. I found his old journals and read them one by one, discovering places he'd traveled, dreams he'd held, regrets he never voiced. In one entry, dated the year I turned 10, he wrote, I heard her laugh through the fence today. Just a small sound, soft as a sparrow's wing. I hope one day she will know that she is the brightest part of my life. I pressed the page to my heart and cried. Months passed. I found myself imagining him beside me sometimes, guiding me through the house he built, smiling at the changes I made, offering the gentle encouragement I had always needed. And slowly I began to feel something I hadn't felt in years. Stillness. Belonging. Home. Then one afternoon in early spring, as I dusted the wooden bird he carved with my initial, I realized the truth with sudden clarity. The fence was gone. Not just the physical one my father built, not just the emotional one I grew up behind. All of it, gone. I was living in a house built by love, not fear. I was connected to people who understood truth, not denial. I had reclaimed my family, even if the shape of that family looked different than anything I'd imagined. And for the first time, I didn't feel like the girl who had to peer through a hole in the fence to find kindness. I felt like a woman who finally knew where she belonged. And I knew the next chapter of my life was waiting. Spring settled over Providence with a gentleness that felt almost foreign, as though the world had decided I'd endured enough bitterness for one lifetime. The air smelled of thawing earth and blooming lilac, and sunlight pooled across Raymond's front porch each morning in a way that made the house glow from within. I found myself waking earlier, moving through the rooms with a quiet reverence, touching doorknobs and window frames, like someone rediscovering the contours of a place she had always belonged but never fully claimed. Raymond's presence lingered in the smallest corners, the indentation in his favorite armchair, the careful organization of his bookshelves, the faint scent of cedar oil near the closet he had used for his sweaters. I no longer wept when I felt him there. Grief had softened into something steadier, something warm enough to hold without breaking. I spoke to him sometimes, not expecting answers, just wanting the comfort of saying things aloud to the person who had shaped my life more than I ever realized. One morning after finishing a long week at the school, my students had just begun their unit on Reconstruction. I stepped outside with a cup of tea and sat on the porch steps. The air was cool, the sky a pale watercolor. Across the property line, where the 10-foot fence once stood like a monument to fear, wild clover had begun to grow in soft green patches. It looked like the yard was healing. I sipped my tea and closed my eyes, remembering the sound of Raymond's voice. If I tried hard enough, I could almost feel the vibration of his words in the wooden steps beneath me. Truth, he once told me, is not a weapon, it is a lantern. Hold it high enough and you will light the way not just for yourself but for anyone willing to see. I didn't understand the depth of that sentence when he first said it. I do now. And I wasn't the only one who felt its impact. A few weeks after the civil case ended, I received an email from Lucas. It was short, almost abrupt. "We're planting a memorial garden for our mother. We'd like you to come." Attached was a photo of the empty plot of land, rectangular, bordered with stones, a small wooden sign staked into the earth waiting for a plaque. I stared at the image until my eyes blurred. I didn't know if I deserved to be part of such an intimate act of remembrance, but I knew I wanted to honor the woman whose death had shaped so many lives. When I arrived in Worcester that weekend, the air hummed with a quiet, respectful energy. Volunteers knelt in the soil planting marigolds, Maria's favorite. Lucas greeted me with a nod. Serena hugged me. She didn't say anything, but she didn't need to. I picked up a trowel and joined them. As we worked, Serena spoke softly. I think she'd be relieved to know the truth finally came out. Lucas added, "Not for revenge, just clarity." I nodded. She deserved that. Serena glanced at me, her eyes gentle. "So did you." The words caught me off guard. I hadn't thought of myself as someone who needed justice. But maybe I did. Maybe justice isn't always loud and public. Sometimes it's quiet, personal, whispered among people who were touched by the same wound. When the garden was finished, Lucas placed a single stone carving at the center. It wasn't elaborate, just Maria's name, her birth and death dates, and the words, "Loved beyond time, remembered with truth." I swallowed hard. That last word, truth, felt like a bridge between our two families. A fragile, hard-won bridge, but a bridge nonetheless. After the small dedication, Serena walked with me to my car. She touched my arm lightly. "You know," she said, "you look like someone who's finally becoming who she was meant to be." I smiled faintly. "I'm trying. You're doing more than trying. You're doing the right thing." Her words lingered all the way home. That night I visited Raymond's grave. The moon hung low over St. Mark's Cemetery, casting silver light across the grass. I knelt beside the stone, brushing away a few stray leaves. I told him about the garden, about Lucas and Serena, about the way the marigolds glowed like embers in the morning light. Then I whispered, "I'm finding my way, just like you hoped I would." A soft breeze moved through the trees as if in answer. As the weeks passed, life settled into a different rhythm. I taught my students about the complicated layers of American history, and sometimes I wondered what they would think if they knew that I carried a family history just as convoluted, full of choices that rippled across decades. I poured myself into my work, into the stories of people who lived long before us, but still shaped the world we stand on. Sometimes after class, I would walk past the courtyard outside the school where students sat laughing on stone benches. I'd catch the sound of a young girl's laugh and feel a tug in my chest, remembering the first time Raymond heard mine, remembering how it changed him. There were still difficult days. I avoided the neighborhood where my parents used to live. My mother sent me a few emails, short ones full of half-formed thoughts and regrets she couldn't articulate. I replied once telling her I needed space. My father didn't contact me at all. I heard through a distant relative that he had moved to Florida, alone. I don't know if he left to escape judgment or to confront it. I don't know if he wakes up each morning thinking of the woman he killed, the father he abandoned, or the daughter who finally stopped letting him hide. I don't know if he ever thinks of truth as anything other than a threat. I hope one day he understands it differently. Not for me, for himself. One Sunday afternoon in early June, I stood in Raymond's backyard with a hammer and a small bag of fresh nails. A soft breeze carried the scent of grass and clover. I walked to the back line of the property, the place where the fence once stood, where the hole near the ground had connected my childhood heart to the man who loved me. The fence was long gone, but I wanted to mark the place where everything began. I pressed a wooden stake into the soil, securing it with a few taps of the hammer. Then I fastened a small plaque I'd carved myself modeled after the delicate birds Raymond once made for me. It read, "Where love found a way through." I stepped back, breath catching in my chest. The plaque shimmered softly in the sunlight, a quiet memorial not just for him but for the girl I used to be, and the woman I had finally become. Later, as dusk settled over the yard, I sat on the porch steps once more. Fireflies blinked in the clover. The world felt so impossibly gentle. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Thank you for staying. Thank you for choosing me." And for the first time, I felt whole. This story, my story, had begun in secrecy, but it ended in clarity, in courage, in a love that refused to die even when everything tried to bury it. If you've stayed with me until the final word, thank you. Stories like this aren't easy to carry, and sharing them is an act of trust. I'd love to hear what part of this journey spoke to you or reminded you of something from your own life. Please feel free to leave a comment below or share your thoughts.